Steele, and thanks for joining us. A little different today. Today we're talking with Australian businessman Tony McLellan. His life story is being published this month. It's called A Glorious Ride. Tony has made, extraordinary amounts of money and had business opportunities and leadership moments that, in any human sense, are really quite amazing. He was given a task as a 35-year-old to go to Egypt and build a city the size of Dubbo. The stories of him flying around the world and a story one day of him meeting 7 vice presidents together of the investment bank Goldman Sachs. But we're not a business program. We're a pastor's program. Tony was chair of the Australian Christian Lobby for a decade, but before that in the United States, he was one of the key laymen who led or assisted in the leadership of one of the very early churches to leave the Episcopal denomination. But Tony, it's the pastor's heart, and the whole book really turns, your whole life, as you tell the story of your life, turns on one very significant week. You're in your late 40s, you've been married for 27, 28 years, your family in Atlanta, and your wife Ray left you, and you ended up reaching out for God.
I sure did, and very, very fortunately, God was right there, ready to take me.
Tell us what happened.
I had spent an incredible busy time, travelling extensively, and just drifted, my concentration drifted, and I wasn't paying attention to my family. And Ray became frustrated and finally said to me, I can't stand this anymore, and decided to go back to Australia. We'd been away for 25 or 30 years then, and I knew she was just kidding. There's just another vapid threat again.
And you said you just went to, or you tell the story of you went off to play tennis.
Yes, I did.
And then
came back and she was gone. I couldn't believe it. That she had the courage to do that. And I immediately got on the phone and tried to intercept her because I'd learned where she was heading to San Francisco to catch a flight to Australia. And I missed her, and she headed back to Australia, stayed with some very, very dear old friends, and then was too scared, too proud to take my call for a week, and I was really stressed, really stressed.
You reached out to Michael Youseff, who now is very famous and preaches on the television and all that kind of thing.
Right.
But at that stage, he was pastoring a little church of 70 people.
That's exactly right.
You were just on the very fringe of.
We'd met Michael because of the connection with Egypt. He's an Egyptian man, born and bred, and a friend in Atlanta said, you must meet this other Egyptian who's lived in Australia rather than Australian who's lived in Egypt. We met him and he invited us to come to his new church, and we weren't opposed to it, but church wasn't a priority for us. But we went along on Christmas Eve and absolutely adored it. And
I guess he was doing almost the follow-up conversation.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
He said, well, here's a whole new family. I better pursue those and get connected.
So you'd visited the church at Christmas. This was
first week in January. Yeah.
He comes around to follow you up as a newcomer.
Yes.
And you're in a mess because she's gone back to Sydney.
Yep. Tell
us about speaking truth to power, because he was a young pastor and you were a powerful man.
Well, you might think of it as a powerful man, but I was a broken man then. I was on the floor in tears, and he picked me up and he said, you need Jesus. And I had no idea who Jesus was. I don't mean that literally, but I had no idea of how it could mean something to me personally. And I said, no, I need help. And he got me sitting down and sat alongside me, and we prayed together. I sought forgiveness, and the new life began. And it instantly, instantly I realised that it was my fault, not Ray's. I thought, she's a silly woman, dashed off. What on earth is happening? And then suddenly realised it was my fault. And I made big effort to get myself redeemed. And Michael directed me to a counsellor, a wonderful Christian man who was absolutely terrific, helping me. 3 or 4 times a week I went to him while I was trying to contact Ray. And eventually Ray took my call and I was able to pack up and go down to Sydney to see her again after 2 weeks separation. And it turned out it was our 200th anniversary, and we were
200th. 200th anniversary.
Australia's 200th.
Yes. Bicentennial.
Yes. And the Friends were on the water at Elizabeth Bay, so we'd walk out and almost touch the ships as they came in. It was a fantastic experience.
Now, you and I have known each other for, 15, 17 years.
Yes.
But I've only ever known, if you like, Christian Tony, and I think, I guess, more mellow Tony. I got hints reading the book that you were a very driven man early on. Yeah.
Very. I think I'm still driven, and Ray would agree with that. And I relentlessly pursue things and don't give up and so on. But not long after our salvation, I had the good fortune to meet the fellow that founded Half Time, and a great Christian man from Dallas who got to Half Time as a Christian man and realised that he needed to be doing something better in the other half. I had lunch
Which is similar to your story, really.
It's how I turned around.
Yeah.
And so I met him. He gave me a copy of his book. Well, I think he gave it to me. Anyway, I got a copy of his book. I loved it. I pulled it out only a week ago, and found it loaded with marks, underlining, asterisks and stuff. And I bought a copy of the book for every member of our family. And Ray and I sat down and said, we got to change our priorities.
How did you then... Well, did you lead her to Christ?
No, Ray had been a believer since about 14 at school, but Michael Youseff, he asked me what I could do, and I said, call Ray and pray for her. And he did, and prayed for her, and I think she refreshed at the same time her own faith. And so it was easy for us to connect again. It's awkward for a while, but we have, when we got back and got settled in, we got into this belief that we really needed to contribute to those around us rather than worry about our own progress.
Just going to push you on this sentence. With no guiding force, the pressures increased. I allowed anger to take over our marriage. I became verbally abusive of Ray and the children. That's a big admission to make,
It breaks my heart now when I think about it, that I was like that, unaware, not caring, just totally unacceptable. But this just brought it to light. It's a very sad thing.
Yeah. What were your kids thinking as they watched this transformation in there? Because, you were a corporate heavy hitter.
Yes.
And then suddenly broken before the cross.
Yes. The kids, I think, appreciate it. They all have different feelings. But I remember the younger son used to wake me up in the morning. Come on, Dad. It's Bible study. You need to get up. That sort of thing, which was so encouraging. He subsequently faded away from his faith.
At Michael Yousseff's church,
yes,
God gave growth. things grew actually quite extraordinarily.
Extraordinary.
After that little beginning of 70-odd people.
Yes.
And then 3-4 years later, you're the church warden at the congregation, and then all sorts of complexities with the diocese. Do you want to take us through that story?
Well, there's a lot to say, but I think it could be summarised by comments that discussion I had with the bishop when we told the bishop we were leaving. We'd made a decision to leave the denomination. And he said to me, "Mr. McLellan, why have we got all this trouble?" And I said, "Bishop, I think it's because this," and I pointed the Bible on the arm of his chair, that we believe that contains all things necessary for faith and life, and I don't think you do. And he said, "You're right, Mr. McLellan, it's a three-legged stool. On one hand, you've got the Word of God, on the other leg, you've got the experience of man, and the third leg, you've got tradition." And I was just so relieved that the manipulation that I felt was happening from the Episcopal Church was no longer going to rule us, so we could rely on the Word of God. And we had the most incredible experience with 1,000 people in our congregation then. And I was the leader and had the responsibility to convince everybody that this was the right thing to do. So worked very closely with the other wardens, and had a number of meetings, and I put one into recess. I said, "Let's fast, come back here on Saturday morning, we'll break our fast, and then we'll pray, and then we'll decide what we want to do." I was convinced, but not everybody else was. And so we did that, fasted and prayed. We sang some praise songs, and I can feel the hairs coming up on my arms now as I think of how electric that was. And I said, "Gentlemen, have you decided?" And as one, they said, "Yes, we want to leave the Episcopal Church and worship God." And it was overwhelming. And the beautiful thing is, in the meantime, I'd thought about writing a letter to the bishop to tell him that we were leaving. Didn't tell anybody, but to put lines for everybody to sign. And when they announced, I said, "Well then, gentlemen, maybe you'd sign this letter." And they couldn't believe it. I'd anticipated the decision, and everybody signed. And that's the letter we took to the bishop the following Monday.
Now, were you one of the first churches? I mean, so many churches have left the Episcopal denomination now over the theological revisionism. I take it this is 1991?
Yes.
Yeah.
We're one of the very first to leave. There was a handful who'd left basically because of disputes about the prayer book, changes to the prayer book, and they had a sort of theological aspect to their leaving. And how I got to know that is we decided that we would form a group with those churches that had left, and including those churches who were thinking of leaving. And we found out what the background was. And then I was asked, an untrained boy from the country, if I would draft the Articles of Faith and the Articles of Governance of a new denomination.
Yeah.
I said, what would I know?
And this was eventually become the Anglican Church in North America.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I'm just trying to put this story together here, because you do mention Foley Beach later in the narrative, but you don't mention him in that chapter.
Yeah.
And am I right? Was Foley Beach, who's now the primate, the Archbishop who's leading the Anglican Church, he was a youth group leader.
He was. And
tell us about young Foley Beach.
Well, I don't...
Because he's a great guy now.
He's terrific. I'm very fond of him and communicate with him quite a lot. And he and Alison had lunch with us when they were out here. Foley was a youth minister. I had practically nothing to do with him.
Yep.
And then he left to train for the priesthood. So he went off, and so I'm disconnected from him.
So did he lead your kids, or your kids were older than you?
Yes, that's right. Right. Yes, so we didn't have a connection to them. But anyway, he left and went off to training, and so didn't have a connection and wasn't about at the time we left. But he remembered me, and it was easy to re-establish a connection with him.
It's incredible to see. What's happened and the way God has blessed Michael Youseff over. I mean, you're talking early days, 70 people, but the extraordinary ministry that he's leading now.
Yeah. Well, I think Michael was incredibly relieved and felt freed when we left, and he was able to get on with his own philosophy. And in fact, when we had the annual meeting of the church right at the end of the year, and they were about to hand over to a new senior warden, Michael burst into tears, because he realised then that he had been led by God to choose me, and that I had the leadership experience and to help bring this whole thing together and leave when we voted approximately 1,000 to 8 to leave. So a big part of my thinking was we had to avoid a schism at all costs, and to bring the whole church behind us like that was a major achievement.
Now, as I read through your book, really the first half is corporate achievement after corporate achievement after corporate achievement. Then there's the moment of coming to trust Christ, and then it's all about Jesus in the second half of the book. How did things change in the corporate world by becoming a Christian?
I suppose they did change.
Because in the book, it's the emphasis is more on the philanthropy in the second half of the book, rather than what you're doing in the work life.
Yes, and I think that's just a flow on from our change of heart through half time. And giving up a lot of time to help. In fact, founded two not-for-profit organisations in America. One in great collaboration with President Bush, and got to know him and did some.
But the thing I'm really interested in is, we touched on a moment ago about, if you like, autocratic leadership and that kind of thing, and the way you were driven as a young man.
Yes.
And you're now the same driven person, but with the Holy Spirit working in your life. How is it different? I mean, what did the secretary and the other executives notice the month after, the year after the convention? How are you different?
Yes.
In that upper corporate boardroom world?
Well, it's a very good question. I wish I'd thought about it before coming here, so I had a proper, crisp answer, but I don't. I'm hoping, and in fact I saw signs of people acknowledging my faith and were heartened and encouraged by it, and I expect, and in fact I know some people were affected by it, and I used to have meetings of these Christian organisations in my office, and people, I presume, knew what was going on, why we got sitting around the board table, all these people. And not so long after I left in the direct corporate world and became chairman of the company and working outside, instead of going to work every day into the company, I had to set up a separate office where I did a lot of that stuff. But I hadn't thought about that. It's a good question.
You talk about how to fire people at the end of your book, and I thought, this is interesting. And tell us, for those watching, tell us how to fire people, and then tell me how Tony would have fired somebody when he was 35, how it would have been different.
Yes, I learned something from from a fellow, very famous fellow, was in the takeover business, and Jim Slater, and he in his 30s controlled British Motor Corporation, and he took over companies here in Australia. And somebody said to him, and when you take over companies like that, almost inevitably they're overstaffed and you have to let people go.
I mean, a number of the stories in your book are stories of going into troubled companies and having to put things right.
Yes.
And then when you got to the end and you said, here are some things I've learned about how to fire people, I thought, you know what? I bet Tony's fired a few people.
A few, and not too many, but a few. And unfortunately, when you get to that level, you're dealing with very senior people. It's not the cleaner you're dealing with, it's senior executives. And a couple of things I've learned. Firstly, as Jim Slater said, you have to be ruthless in the decision and considerate in the execution. And such a good policy, I think. You so often put it off because you're a bit afraid and don't want to face the tough meeting. So you have to make the decision ruthlessly and then figure out how you can do it in a humane, gentle way. The other aspect of that I've learned is a lot of people, many people who you have to let go, already know they're in the wrong spot and they're relieved. It's hard to think, I'm talking to you saying you'll have to leave this church. You've been a fine minister, but time's come for you to move on. But you already know that. And people are, thank heavens, it's been figured out. I don't have to worry about it anymore. So that's another thing that I've learned. And I'd hate this to evolve, that people think I just run around firing people. I'm trying to be much more encouraging than that.
You played a very significant role in the Australian Christian lobby for a decade.
Yes.
And I mean, that's something you mark as a major achievement, really.
Oh, it's been the most wonderful experience. People I've met, the growth of the organisation, it's been just extraordinary. Here we are. When I joined, we had about 3,500 supporters. We've got 228,000 today. Don't get me wrong, that's not because of me, but we put it on a path of growth, and it was substantial, and it's continued very strongly since then.
I want to come back to speaking truth to power, because and I'm imagining we've got a lot of ministers watching. Well, sorry, we do have a lot of ministers watching us and engaging with us, and we have business people, powerful people in our churches, and sometimes we're nervous about how to relate to people like you who are powerful in the corporate world. And what's your advice to what have ministers done right and wrong as we've spoken to you?
Well, I must tell you, I've had different feelings about different ministers. I've been involved in a few churches, and some ministers, I pick, the first one that comes to my mind is Simon Manchester, of whom I have enormous admiration.
And you were in his church for a decade?
Yes, for a decade. I love being there, and I have a very nice relationship with him now. I could talk to him about anything, and other people in a similar way.
Did he ever come to you and say, Tony, here's a godliness issue I just want you to think about, or something like that?
Yes. Simon would do that. Yeah, Simon would do that. I remember him calling up one afternoon and he said, are you free? I'd love to talk to you about this issue. It was very flattering, and I told him, and whether he did it or not, that's his choice. But it's very nice to have that relationship, obviously. It's not because I know more than he does, but I know a different angle. I've had a different experience, and I've had lots of leadership experiences, building teams, motivating people, setting goals, and so on. And that's been an enormous help to me in the not-for-profit world. You know, I joined Habitat for Humanity when I came back from overseas. Habitat was founded in Georgia, where we lived, and had a good involvement. I said, "Oh, we'll be chairman in Australia." Well, that was very flattering. When we came to Australia, they were doing about 3 houses a year, and I built it up to well over 1,000. Now, why is that? It's just because I know how to roll up my sleeves.
Why does everything turn to gold when you do it?
It does, and I've been absolutely frat broke.
Well, no, that's true, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tell us about that, because this is like 2-3 years after coming to Christ.
Yep.
You actually, somebody gave you $100 because you needed $100.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And the great lesson from that is that we learned from John 15 about the vine, how God prunes those who love and respect him because he wants them to bear more fruit. And now it's critical for you to get out of your system any unconfessed sin. And so Ray and I spent nights kneeling. In those days we knelt beside the bed to pray, making sure there was nothing there. And then God started to recover us. We were broke because we didn't have the money to continue on the software company.
I mean, you'd gone from a couple of Concorde flights a month to not having $100. And you kind of alluded to pride as the kind of issue that brought you down.
I'm sure it is. And I know today I still have pride. I'm at least conscious of it. I wasn't conscious then, and I know it's one of the seven deadly sins. I know it strikes all men, and the evil one prowls around like a roaring lion, wanting to pounce. How he tempts you with ill-gotten gains, how he tempts you into sexual exploits, and at least I'm conscious of that and alert to it, and I believe developed a proper defence against it. But I'm always ready to advise men, especially men in elevated positions, even men in churches. And we saw it with our own eyes in a church with 28,500 members in Atlanta. We saw the pastor brought down. And it's pretty dramatic. I was well connected.
Pride brought him down.
Yeah. Well, sexual exploits, which is just pride.
Right, yeah.
See, somehow he thought with his own jet plane I can muck around with boys. You know, it's just like I'm different. It is just disgusting. And so I'm very conscious of it, and I certainly suffered from it grossly. So I'm.
But you were brought down by God from that extraordinary level.
Yes.
Of flying the world.
Yes.
To not having $100.
Yep. And learning then the necessity to clean up anything that might be hanging over, and believing that God was pruning us, not punishing us. And
tell us about that month of desperation before the Almighty.
Well, it wasn't a month; it was years. And we struggled. I got our house foreclosed on, lost our house, we sold our car, we had nothing. And then we met a guy.
That's the opposite of the prosperity. You've turned to Christ and now you're crushed.
So, why?
Yeah.
Why? And fortunately, a very, very wise man picked it up and helped us understand through John 15. And when, in fact, when we celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary...
You wrote about this. You got Simon Manchester to preach that passage.
Yeah, and he was fantastic.
Thanks so much for coming to talk to us. Tony McLellan has been my guest. From Jumble Plains to Eternity is the book, and a glorious ride. Thanks for joining us.
It's been such a pleasure to be with you.
And you've been with us on the Pastor's Heart this afternoon. We will look forward to your company next Tuesday.